At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Well, hello and welcome to another Drug Science Podcast. And today we're focusing on prisons, and I'm delighted that we have two of the UK's leading experts in the question of drugs in prison, and particularly the really challenging problem of drug deaths in prisons. So welcome, Susanne MacGregor and Karen Jukes. And let's start off by you introducing yourselves so that people can get a sense of what you really want them to know about you. So go on, Susanne, since you're sort of my kind of age, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, I'm actually now a retired professor, but I'm honorary professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and emeritus at Middlesex. So it's quite good. I can do the sort of research I want to do. I don't need to worry too much about funding and that sort of thing. So, I mean, what I usually say when you say, why do I do research on drugs and how did I get into research on drugs? I usually answer that it was through homelessness. And at the beginning of my career, I came down from Edinburgh to London, and the first post I got was at the MRC Social Psychiatry Research Unit at the Institute of Psychiatry with John Wing. And that's now part of King's College, University of London. And we were looking at the question of homelessness in London. And it was the period, this was in the 1970s, it was the period of deinstitutionalization. So the large mental hospitals were closing down, and people were worried that there were a lot of homeless people on the streets of London and in other cities who'd just been sort of discarded from the mental hospitals. So I did that work with John Wing and with David Tidmarsh, who went on to become Deputy Governor at Broadmoor Prison. So there was a connection there. And the interesting thing about that, I mean, that's another story, but the interesting thing about that is that there was very, very little use of drugs amongst the homeless population at that time, or at least in our sample. There were indeed quite a high proportion of people with mental illnesses and with histories of psychiatric treatment and people who were dependent on alcohol. But looking back, it's really quite remarkable how few were involved with drugs at all. So that was the 70s, it was yet to happen. And so after that, I did other research on homelessness. I looked at Great Chapel Street Medical Centre in Soho, which was a walk-in medical centre for young homeless in Soho. And then later on became involved with City Roads, which was an experimental crisis intervention service for what were then called multiple drug misusers, often at the time people taking barbiturates, who were turning up at A&E departments, and the A&E departments didn't know what to do with them. And so this hostel was set up where people often were referred from A&E, although some people were referred from other places, and they could stay there for up to 3 weeks. They were detoxified, they were fed and clothed and bathed, and they slept, and they were assessed, and all being well, they were then referred on to rehabilitation, such places as Phoenix House, which was not far away then. And that was really a pretty good system, and we concluded it was a good system and there should be more. And unfortunately, as a sign of the times, City Roads closed a few years ago. So that's an indication of how things have gone.
You can tell us who to blame in a minute, but carry on with your story.
Yeah, no, that's just basically where I'm saying I sort of, I was interested in homelessness. I got into drugs. And although I tried to do other sorts of research and did wander off doing other things, I often got drawn back into drugs research, partly because, of course, from then on, the problem and the amount of drug use and the issue of drug policy became so huge. And so one was drawn back to it. And I suppose that also links to my particular concern with the homeless, with the most excluded, the stigmatized, and the most marginalized.
And prisons? That's a recent...
Well, prisons is Karen's forte, yes.
Okay, you're right. So you're the homeless, and Karen, tell us a bit more then about why you got into prisons and prison.
Sure. I'm a professor in criminology at Middlesex, and I've always been interested in prisons. I'm originally from Canada, so I came over to the UK in 1990 to take my MPhil in criminology at the University of Cambridge. And if you remember back to that period of time, 1989, 1990, it was a very volatile time for the prison system in the UK. The prison system was in complete crisis, as it is today. It's a very similar story. There was a lot of unrest and riots in prisons due to prison conditions. Very serious riots took place at Strangeways. You might remember that up in Manchester. And that took place in 1990. So it was a really interesting time to be studying prisons and how they could be reformed. So my master's thesis looked at through care programs in prisons. So programs that aim to prepare people for release and then their aftercare in the community. And then after my master's, I went on and worked at the Home Office Research and Planning Unit for 3 years. And I didn't look at prisons and I didn't look at drugs. I was working on refugee resettlement, so it was completely different. But then I became a research fellow with Susanne at Middlesex, and she's really the one who got me into the drugs and into the drugs policy side of things. And we were working on a number of different projects. So we were working on projects that were funded by the Home Office Drug Prevention Unit, the Cabinet Office, and there was a big study that she had that was funded by the Department of Health on treatment. And we were looking at ways to sort of bring the drugs work that I was working on with her in with my interest with prisons. And at the time, it was 1995, and the first Tackling Drugs Together drug strategy came out, and connected with that was the 1995 prison drug strategy. So what my PhD did is it looked at the lead up to that strategy going back to 1980 and then the aftermath. And so I was really interested in looking at the balance or the sort of tension between treatment and punishment in the development of prison drug policy. So looking at the balance between supply reduction activities, security and control sort of measures, and demand reduction activities. So thinking about therapy and treatment and sort of harm reduction issues. And I mean, since then, my career sort of moved on. I've moved more, I would say, into the drug side of things, looking more at drugs policy more generally, and more recently looking at drugs prevention initiatives. But I'm always kind of drawn back to looking at drugs and prisons. And that sort of links into the work that Susanne and I have been working on recently over the last sort of 3 or 4 years.
Well, tell us about that then. Who's going to kick off?
Perhaps I'll say why, when Karen suggested that we do this research, it did link with my then interests. And then Karen can go and talk about her great idea for this research. So I got interested in the lack of services for older drug users, as I was aging myself, and the lack of awareness of their needs. And as a result of that, I became a member of an ACMD working group, which produced a report on the aging cohort of drug users. Now, this notion of the aging cohort has been criticized, and it's true that the idea may have been overemphasized, especially, I think, the idea that somehow this was a generation who started to use in the heroin epidemic of the 80s, and they continued to use, and they were then dying early. And there was in that a kind of assumption that somehow when this cohort passed through the system, all would be well. And in fact, most of the people who are now older drug users were born later. You know, they came into drug using in the 90s and noughties, as it were. So, and it was a mistake to think somehow, if people thought that the problem was just a hangover from the heroin epidemic of the 80s. You know, we've actually since then had more drugs being taken by more people in more varied ways. And however, there is something in the argument, which is that, and we found this in the research that we looked at in the working group, there's no doubt about that if you take drugs for a long time, it has an effect on your body. And so, in general, the biological age of the older drug user is greater than their chronological age. And indeed, you know, we know about the diseases of HIV and hepatitis and so on. But in addition, so many were smoking, so they have COPD, and it's been shown that they are more likely to have cardiovascular diseases and to die of cancer and so on. So there's a genuine issue of the fact that your body, as you get older, can't really do the things that you could do when you were younger, and you have to respond to that and react. So I think that was quite an important thing. And then at the same time, we were then seeing a rise in drug-related deaths. There was the opioid crisis in the United States and Canada and North America and so on. So there's a general interest in drug-related deaths, and I was interested in that. And I did a study on media framings of drug-related deaths, on the assumption that the way the media frames the problem shapes the policy response, and wrote a chapter for a book, the Routledge Handbook of Intoxicants and Intoxication, which Geoffrey Hunt and his colleagues edited. And in that, I did a little study of national and local media coverage of drug-related deaths in the UK. And basically, what one found is the analysis of drug-related deaths in public discourse tends to focus on seeing it as a crisis. So it's of interest if it's seen as a crisis. And the focus was very much on the issue of overdoses, not on other kinds of drug-related deaths. And there were a number of explanations of what was going on. The explanations tend to focus on who or what to blame. That's the general question. Who can we blame, or what can we blame? And there were 4 types of groups who would be blamed. First of all, they might be bad actors. So it would be dealers or organised crime, big pharma, and then particularly new substances. So new substances such as fentanyl, and in our case later on, novel psychoactive substances do get a lot of attention. The second type of explanation looks at the characteristics of the victims, and there the aging cohort thesis reappears. The third kind of explanation would talk about social responses and focus on issues of stigma, marginalisation, the lack of services, and policy, particularly prohibition. And a fourth set would talk about social determinants, saying that the dominant neoliberal paradigm, which we've lived through for the last 40 years, which focuses on the risk society and tends to assume that it's a situation of rational choice, and if you just give people enough information, they will make the right decisions, and they then take responsibility for their decisions, doesn't really work because risks are not evenly shared and the individual doesn't have control over those risks. And so in that you have those explanations which talk about inequality and the diseases of despair. So I was interested in the topic, and also as I looked at it, the other concept I think I'd like to throw in is a concept I came across from work by Susanne Fraser in Australia, which is of ungrievable deaths. And I certainly found that in the UK it was the same situation, that there are some deaths which are given attention and are grieved over. And obviously the classic case in the media is the young, blonde female who's taken one ecstasy tablet and dies on the first use, whereas the majority of deaths are of slightly older males who are taking a mixture of methadone and benzos and so on, and they tend not to be mentioned. So that's certainly that concept of ungrievable deaths, I think, is one which is relevant, and we import it into our research on drug-related deaths in prison. So when Karen came up with this great idea to look at the PPO reports, I said, yes, this does interest me. So perhaps Karen would tell us all about what PPO reports are. And
before you do that, Karen, I just wanted to share with you an experience I had yesterday. I did an interview on an unexpected opiate death in the West Country, and it was kind of chilling to be grilled by these two TV presenters who were saying, "Well, it was his choice, wasn't it?" And you think, actually, I don't think it was his choice. I don't think he actually knew he was taking a nitazine, because if he had known, he probably wouldn't have taken it. But I hadn't come across that concept of ungrievable deaths, and clearly, a lot of the media don't really care about most drug users because they don't value them as people that actually say they grieve over. So anyway, a little bit of an anecdote from me. The problem's still there. If you had any doubts, Susanne. No, Karen, what was your great vision?
Well, I think it's also about looking at populations that don't get recognition when they're dying, and the prison population is one of those. And it was during the pandemic, actually, that we decided to do this project, because the Prison and Probation Ombudsman investigates every fatal incident that occurs in prison, and that includes drug-related deaths. The PPO,
That's the PPO,
yeah.
Prison and Probation.
That's the PPO. Ombudsman. Prison and Probation Ombudsman, yeah. And so they're all available online, and you can analyze them. They run at about 10 to 15 pages, and they include, sort of interviews with staff and people in prison about what was happening to the person who died prior to their death. So you get a picture of what was going on. And they also review prison records and policy. So we decided that we would analyze a sample of these, and we started looking at them from 2015 up until 2020. And this was in the first study that we did. And what emerged from our analysis was a sort of risk matrix from the cases that we looked at, where a number of sort of components combined to produce a drug-related death. So this included things like the type of substances that were being used, individual characteristics and behaviors, the sort of immediate circumstances surrounding the death, and then the wider sort of prison environment. And if we think about the risky substances, there was an increasing role that was being played by new psychoactive substances in the deaths. 57% of the cases that we looked at involved a new psychoactive substance. And the majority of these were related to synthetic cannabinoids. So these are, as you know, Dave, compounds that sort of mimic cannabis, but are chemical compounds and synthetics. In the early period, there was a real lack of knowledge around new psychoactive substances amongst those people that are using them, but also with the prison staff and the pathologists. So a lot of the warning signs were being missed repeatedly. For example, people were being taken into hospital with cardiac arrest repeatedly. And, there was a suspicion that they'd taken synthetic cannabinoids, but, the two things weren't put together. So there was this whole set of sort of risky substances, and there was also an increasing use of prescribed medication and mixing that with synthetic cannabinoids.
This is the gabapentin.
And then there was,
this is the rise of gabapentin.
Yeah, pregabalin, gabapentin, yeah. And also drugs for epilepsy and different, all sorts of different prescribed medication that people had a legitimate script for within the prisons. And then there was a sort of a set of individual characteristics. So the people who died had complex needs in relation to their physical and mental health. Almost all had a history of substance use, which isn't surprising. Over half, 57%, had a mental health condition, and one quarter, 26%, had an underlying physical health condition, and 43% were aged over 40. So this links into Susanne's earlier comments about this sort of aging cohort in the prison population. That is aging, that's quite an elderly group. So there was all these individual characteristics that were sort of observable in the cases. And then there was a set of risky behaviors or experiences. I mentioned the mixing of substances, so the prescribed medication with the new psychoactive substances, but also stockpiling substances and then taking a large amount all at once. So there was, examples of that in the cases. Then there was things like constructing makeshift pipes and inhalers to smoke the substances, concealing the substances within the body in wraps, and then those bursting open. There's a couple of deaths that were related to that. And then there was lots of reference in the reports to debt and bullying around use and supply. And there was a couple of really awful examples where people had been used, vulnerable people had been used to test batches of the new psychoactive substances.
Sorry, just to be clear about that, Karen. So that is news to me. I suppose what you might call the more knowledgeable prisoners were aware that these synthetic cannabinoids were a bit unpredictable, and they didn't actually know what they were getting, and most of us didn't even know what they were getting. So they'd actually tried out on vulnerable prisoners who owed them money, presumably, and that was sort of, and to see if it was safe. Wow, I really hadn't heard of that. That is chilling, isn't it?
Yeah, they were called. There's references to it in many of the reports that we looked at, but they're called the spice pigs, so guinea pigs for the spice. Yeah. And then there was a set of sort of risky circumstances. So the immediate circumstances surrounding the risk of death, delays in sort of emergency codes being issued, and then delays in ambulances being called. There was equipment that wasn't working, defibrillators and things like that could save a life. Sometimes people didn't know where they were located in the prison. Sometimes when they got to them, they didn't actually work. There was a lack of monitoring, so not checking on people when they were unresponsive. So when it came to roll call in the morning, somebody wouldn't respond and they would just leave them to the next roll call. So people could have been lying dead for many hours, as a result of that. And then not responding to reports of overdose and people that were under the influence. So the increased risk of death was also at transition periods within the prison. So on arrival, that was a key risky period. After recall, and when someone might be transferred to a new prison. So those were all sort of key risky transition points. And then there was an increased risk on certain dates. So sometimes these were linked to celebrations like birthdays and holidays. So people might experiment with something new, or they might combine a whole bunch of stuff together.
Would they be presents for a birthday? Would people be given things?
Well, they might have been. There wasn't anything like that in the reports, but that could be. Yes, absolutely. I hadn't even thought of that.
Well, the reason I say that is it's one of these statistics you have from particularly the large US universities where the drinking age is 21, and most of them lose 2 or 3 people every year on their 21st birthday because people just go out and get their mates drunk and not realizing that they can poison them to death. So, I just wondered if the same thing happened in prisons, but probably to a less extent.
Yeah, there was nothing written in the reports, but I would imagine that that could be linked as well. And there was also a risk when traumatic events happen. So if somebody had a death in the family or a divorce, so that would be another risky point in time. And of course, all of this is happening in this incredibly high risk environment. And so, the prison crisis, which we've sort of talked about, is, the population is increasing. There's overcrowding 2 and 3 to a cell. There's staff shortages, cuts to prison services, lack of purposeful activity. So people not being able to get to, education, training, rehabilitative programs. So literally being locked down in their cell for 23 hours a day. And that leads to increasing levels of violence, increasing self-harm. So what we argue in this paper is that these different components interact in complex ways to create this sort of risk matrix, which is a number of individual, situational, and systemic factors which result in a death.
Yeah, and very, very many. So quite hard to know. There's no simple solution, is there?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the numbers are going up. I mean, I think we felt that it looks as though the rate is not greater in prison than in the general population, but the numbers seem to have increased fourfold from about 2015. So before 2015, there would be one a month, and now that's sort of one a week. So it's becoming more common, and certainly up to 2018, the role of synthetic cannabinoids became increasingly pronounced. So this became a greater issue. And I think, did Karen mention, I mean, that these are used in the prison because they're cheaper, they're easier to smuggle in, and
They don't smell
initially they could not be detected. And certainly, as you, I think, indicated, and as you indicated, the kind of more experienced drug user would not choose to use them. There was one guy who said, he wouldn't use them because he'd had a heart condition and he knew it would affect his heart. And quite a lot of the postmortems do refer to cardiac arrest as the precipitating cause of death. And so there is a link to that. And yet there are people who use them because there's no alternative once they're in the prison.
Well, yes, I mean, it is true. It's probably almost unique in human history that novel drugs were tested for the very first time on humans. I mean, normally we test them on animals and get some evidence of, but here, these drugs were going straight from the laboratory to humans. And
not only just sort of, I mean, it's certainly in one sense that seems quite rational to test, but it is definitely the weaker people. You have a hierarchy of masculinity in this prison, toxic masculinity and power. So it's the weaker, vulnerable, older people with mental illness, people with learning disabilities. They're the people who are exploited. And there are lots of examples of it being used as a form of entertainment. So because people's behavior is so erratic and odd, it was seen as something, that was just a kind of entertainment. And also, to begin with, the impression was that the staff also underestimated the dangers. They saw them as perhaps similar to cannabis and turned a blind eye. Later on, they were enjoined to pay more attention and to not let this go on. But in the early days, some of the descriptions are of a really chaotic situation. So there's one example, for example, of a man who, this is rather an extreme example, but a man who had a history of alcohol misuse in the community. He began using drugs in the prison, and this escalated before he died. He had a number of diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, antisocial personality disorder, and he was afraid to leave his cell because of fear of bullying. And it was said he was often offered PS. In the PPO reports, they talk about PS, which they mean psychoactive substances, they mean synthetic cannabinoid. And he was offered this as a challenge so they can laugh at the state he got into. And then another prisoner told staff that the man had been pressured to take PS by other prisoners around 10 minutes before he collapsed. He passed out and prisoners slapped him. When he started to regain consciousness, he was offered half an ID card-sized piece of PS paper free of charge, and then he relapsed into unconsciousness and died. There's no intention to kill him, but some of these cases, not all of them, but some of them, do verge towards what you might think of as manslaughter. There's a culpability.
is it generally not known that people must People must know. Do prisoners not know of the deaths in prison from synthetic cannabinoids? Are they not taught about that?
Well, increasingly, the substance misuse teams try to get this information across. But, again, it's a matter of risk. It's so extensive. The information is that something like half the prisoners are found to be using drugs, and the majority of them are using PS, as they call it. So it's rife. So the proportion who actually die, I wouldn't be able to
Yes,
calculate.
and of course, if they're encouraged to, or, yes, then yeah, the alternative might be even worse. Yes. So I've often been confused as to why this happened, and I presume it was driven by testing for cannabis, which didn't seem to be a very logical thing to start. But I've never spoken to experts like you about this. So why do you think we went wrong?
I mean, I think that there's some truth in that, in the sense that the mandatory drug testing came in as part of the 1995 prison drug strategy. And, there was evidence that people were switching from cannabis to heroin because of that mandatory drug testing policy, these unintended consequences of that policy. And I think when we look at what's happened with the change in substances, I'm not sure about the supply. So I'm not sure about, how much heroin was actually getting in during this period of time. Availability is really constrained within the prison. But I think when synthetic cannabinoids, were being used in the community, it was really the perfect drug for the prison, because you could, smuggle it in quite easily. It wasn't detected by mandatory drug testing initially. So, there was this perception amongst the people who were using it, and also by the staff, that actually this is legal. It's a legal high. We had that with all the new psychoactive substances. So there was that sort of shift, and it became the perfect drug, because you could make a lot of money off it, and there was no smell, as you mentioned earlier. So it wasn't giving off an odor or anything like that. You didn't need, syringes or anything like that. It's
Yeah, I
kind of
know.
perfect.
So what's the solution? Sorry, what's the strategy that you would encourage us to start developing towards a solution?
I think our second paper really looks at how this was responded to, the sort of different modes of governance that we can see in the response. And Susanne mentioned earlier about this sort of avoidance and denial, this idea that was, we don't know about it, that, we don't understand it, so we don't have to do anything about it. And I think what was happening is the prison and probation ombudsman and the chief inspector of prisons was making a lot of recommendations. They were raising the alarm repeatedly about this, but prisons were failing to implement the recommendations. And there wasn't really a national strategy about how to deal with new psychoactive substances in prisons. So the response really came, as sort of coercive controls. So things like legislation was introduced, new powers to, test, to search, to do all that kind of stuff, bring in things like drone blocking technology, body scanners, drug detection, sort of scanners, all that kind of security stuff. And I call these kind of placebo policies, because they give the impression that action's being taken, that, we're clamping down on this issue. But what we're not getting at is the root cause. So why are people using these substances to this extent within prison? So I think when you look at the response, eventually, and Susanne will probably want to say a little bit more about this, but you get this sort of compartmentalization, this micromanagement of the problem. So we'll have a bit of training with the staff. We'll, have some guidance on emergency responses and how to respond to an overdose. We'll do a few reviews of policy around safety and violence. And what this resulted in was a really piecemeal response, with each prison developing their own response to new psychoactive substances. And I think there was that sort of over reliance on technological solutions, thinking about the drones and the scanners and all that kind of stuff. And loads of money was spent on this, millions were spent on this kind of technology.
I've often wondered whether some politicians were complicit in the desire to move to the most expensive solution, which was technology. And I don't know whether you think there might have been conflicts of interest there. I mean, there are in many other branches of decision making. It just seemed completely bizarre to me that we would be spending so much money on such expensive and continually needing updating of machinery. I mean, do you have any estimates of how much we've actually spent on the technology?
No, that would be a really good project, David. Absolutely. I'd like to add it up and compare it with what's spent on treatment and
Exactly.
harm reduction. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. The emphasis was very much, as Karen's saying, on attempting to control supply. And they did get, things did improve, but they would improve in some prisons. But, you would then read reports when some prisons were still having problems and there were still broken windows, and there were still broken scanners or no scanners, or there were 100 new prisoners being admitted, regularly, and it was impossible to scan everything. And people had so much property, it was impossible to search it all. So you got a sort of sense, on the one hand, of increasing amount of guidance, instructions, policy papers, and a wonderful response in terms of action plans, which became increasingly detailed and systematic. And there was more attention. It's true that there was much more attention to drugs over time, and one has to say that. But it was almost as though there was this increasing gap, there was my reading, an increasing gap between the managerialist statements on the one hand and then these descriptions of the reality of what was going on the ground, And what I felt increasing sympathy for the prison staff themselves, that they were trying to cope with an extremely difficult situation where they were under-resourced, there was staff turnover, the experienced staff had left, and they were just trying to contain the situation. And all these huge documents with guidance in them, how could they have time to read them? So that in practice, I'm sure on the ground, they would at least have rules of thumb that they operated with rather than, knowing the details of all the guidance. So it's that whole problem of the managerialist response and the lack of attention to demand. And what's the other thing that I would want to also mention is the whole issue of the quality of drug treatment in prisons. I mean, it's again a simple point, but the emphasis is very much.
There are a couple of aspects of the spice problem I just wanted to touch on with both of you. I mean, the one that I found extremely disillusioning was that, there is an antidote to spice. In fact, there are a number. They're called cannabis receptor antagonists. One was made, one was a medicine for obesity. It was removed on the grounds that it could cause low mood in some people. But giving it once to someone who was dying of spice would reverse the overdose. And when Jeremy Hunt was health secretary, I wrote to him, I said, look, this drug exists. It's been proved to be safe in humans. Why don't we basically get it made and used in our prisons? Because it seems to me our prisons are worse than most other countries' prisons. It's to save lives and to save money. And he wrote back and he said, well, the Department of Health doesn't make medicines. That's kind of a rather bizarre reply from the Minister of Health. You don't even have to make a medicine; you just have to make it available. And I just thought that just summed up the utter lack of any kind of insight into.
Well, that's really, really interesting because that's, this is the whole thing about ungrievable lives and ungrievable deaths. And there are hierarchies of grievability. So there's a huge amount of attention now, even in the drugs community, to providing naloxone, and that's now being rolled out and it's generally available and so on. There's no reference to what you've been talking about. I mean, that's really interesting information. Because spice, in inverted commas, is the drug that is used only by the homeless and by people in prison. Anybody with any alternative would not use it, with any choice. They prefer to use something else.
So I'm banging that drum. Still banging that drum, and I'm writing a piece for Lancet Psychiatry on a whole range of issues which could be better approached using more rational pharmacological treatments, and that's one of them. So yeah, I'll keep flagging that up, because it's just one of many examples of very flawed logic in terms of thinking about how we should produce and provide harm reduction and safety. And just on the point of naloxone, look how long it took. We've had naloxone for 50 years, and it's taken us 48 of them to get to a point where now people can get it when they need it. So that was the second point I just wanted to make about spice. Is I usually say it's a uniquely British problem, but I'm not entirely sure. Do you have any knowledge of its use outside of this country? Is it in other prisons, or do they? I don't know.
Well, people say it's I mean, I've heard that said, but then I did see some research which was referring to an apparent element in, I think it was in the Netherlands, but it was not being tested for. And so I'm a little bit suspicious when the Europeans say we don't have a problem, that it goes back to that whole issue that we had, 10 years ago, when people weren't testing for it. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the examples of, high potency cannabis and so on, which is being talked about, is actually synthetic cannabinoids being added, at least to the.
But there will be data on prison deaths in other countries. I bet the Dutch have fewer prison deaths per head of prison population than we do. Anyway, that's just a hypothesis. Back to you, Suzanne. I didn't want to interrupt, but
no, it goes back to, just sort of what do we do, and where do you begin? And I really don't know. But there are a few simple points that one could go back to. I mean, the problem is overcrowding in prisons. There are too many people in prisons, and so could we not reduce the numbers? Now, it wouldn't save money, but there are something like 27% of the people who died in our cohort were people with clearly psychotic mental illness. They had schizophrenia, bipolar disease, and they would be called comorbid and so on, and they had histories of psychiatric treatment. Though this is putting aside those people with, in inverted commas, personality disorders. So it seems to me those people should unquestionably be in, a secure psychiatric hospital. They shouldn't be in prison. So that would be, at a stroke, although it would be a different section. I'm struck by, and this is a different discussion, Karen knows more about it, but I'm very struck by the amount of medication which is being prescribed in the prisons, a huge amount of prescribing, probably because that's all they can do. But this whole issue of the interaction of substances is really important. And then linking to that is the regime of drug treatment in the prisons, which is predominantly low suboptimal dosage and then a withdrawal. And so, of course, people top up and they go to the illicit supply to top up, and they top up with a range of unknown substances. So if you introduced drug treatment in prisons, which was at least along the lines of that recommended in the Orange Guidelines, that would improve things. And then finally, there are something like a third of the people who are in the prison who are not there for offences of violence. 2/3 of them have committed I'm not saying these are super duper people, they've committed murder and drink driving and deaths and so on, all sorts of things. But a third of them have committed property related or other non-violent offences. And so one could look at the sentencing regime for such people. So it would be possible to reduce the numbers in prison by looking at, the way we're treating people.
Yeah, there's a peculiarly British desire to punish, isn't there? I have a view it comes from British public schools, but we won't go there. What's your thought, Karen? Coming from a much more rational country. In fact, are you here to help us? Are you here to be horrified?
I'm here to help. horrified and to help. But I think really we have to look at the emerging threats, and nitazines are in the drug supply in prisons. And we've seen that with the recent deaths at Park Prison in Wales. And so I think that we really need to respond rapidly. We can't have this slow response that we had to synthetic cannabinoids. We really need to go in quick and go in hard and, get to grips with the problem very quickly. Because there was somebody on the news last night talking about the deaths in parks, and they said, this is the tip of the iceberg. These nitazines will be in every prison in the UK. So that really needs an urgent and rapid response. So I think monitoring, early warning systems, drug checking in prisons needs to be trialed, harm reduction.
That's, to my mind, is a really interesting concept. Given the fact we haven't managed to, I think we've just managed in Bristol now to have drug checking on a Saturday afternoon. I love the idea of drug checking in prisons, but I think, and maybe we should work with you. Because drug science, we're very keen on developing, safe injection spaces and that. But that, to my mind, that's such a wonderful concept. But I think it might be quite an interesting one to have a dialogue with.
But that would save lives. This would save lives. And I think the other thing is that when you look at other countries, they are trialing innovative sort of measures. Canada has 3 overdose prevention centers in prisons, and I think if they can do it, I know we're struggling to get them in the community, but if they can do it in prisons, we should be able to do this as well. So I think it does need a radical solution.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you can speak from a country that actually has made much more progress than we have in terms of helping people stay alive. The question is, who do you have the dialogue with? Because I got, having talked to prison governors about this drug testing, they seem almost impotent. It's almost, they're not really governed. They're like policemen. They don't really govern. They just do what they're told by whatever department it is. I guess it's the Home Office or the Department of Justice. Can we get them on side, do you think? Is that something? Do you talk to them much?
No, I was just saying, I don't think it's an innately British thing to want to punish and so on. We did used to have a different regime, and we did experiment in prisons, decades ago. So, I can see that we wouldn't have a complete reformation overnight. But one possibility would be to at least propose some experiments and to have an experimental prison where your antidote for psychoactive substances was available, naloxone was available, good drug treatment was available, and so on, And then you could also possibly have another prison to compare it with, which was a completely, strong control system.
Yeah. Yes, it's not entirely clear to me whether people who work in the Home Office or the Department of Justice are actually interested in generating evidence, but that's another story, isn't it? It's because they like policy directives. You basically, and they like very, very, very thick policy directives, and it is embarrassing that we haven't got.
But don't they do what their political masters tell them? So we have to hope that if the political discourse were to change, possibly.
Well, I think if the political, it has to change, and the question is, will it change? And I don't know. It's an unusual situation we're in, where we have the likely next prime minister has put more people in prison for drug offences than anyone in the history of Britain, which is so. Maybe it's time for him to sort of fess up and say, "Let's do it differently." Now I'm in power. I don't know. We'll see.
Oh dear.
But there's no doubt we've got to do things differently.
It's the point that Karen was making, that there is actually an emerging crisis coming on the horizon, and there will be a moral panic and around this, and so perhaps if there are proposals for alternatives available, it might be that there's a moment of
it's the need is here. The question is, how do we get that discourse going with the people that make the decisions? And I don't know. Certainly, ministers don't come and talk to drug science. We challenge them, and maybe we are too challenging. But maybe academics like you, do they ever reach out to you for guidance?
Well, sometimes, David. but not always. And they wouldn't probably be wanting to look at sort of innovation, and they would be looking at, trialing abstinence-based treatment and those types of measures. If you look at what's currently being proposed, there's a real emphasis on abstinence-based treatment, incentivized substance-free living units and things like that within prisons. So it's very much, getting rid of the drugs and not sort of accepting that some harm reduction needs to happen as well.
Could you just explain to the listeners who won't have ever come across this concept of incentivized drug-free places in prisons? What does that mean? You basically get your own room, do you?
You probably are on a more of an enhanced regime, so you have access to, I don't know, more time outside of cells, or TV privileges, or that type of thing. It will be incentivized in terms of rewards and privileges, I would imagine.
So if you
So those are being trialed at the moment.
Right, you urine test prisoners on a sort of weekly basis and then see.
But this will relate to the reality on the ground, because we've got examples of drug-related deaths in the recovery wings, in the segregation units, so the whole issue of implementation, what's really happening on the ground will be crucial.
And what happens when they leave? And we know that those 2 weeks after they leave prison is the most dangerous 2 weeks of their lives, except for the first day of birth. So, yes, the relapse rates. So, yeah, there's clearly a lot of need to have harm reduction strategies. Actually, John Strang, by the way, I believe has got another grant to study how you could optimize the use of drugs like naloxone or naltrexone in people coming out of prison. So that'll be useful for the opiate users. But we don't have anything for spice users, because unless a commercial company wants to make money out of selling it. And by the way, the reason companies don't develop this is because the governments won't say they'll reimburse them. So you've got a sort of 10-year development plan, and you hope eventually governments say they want it, and governments say they don't want it. Then the company's bankrupt. So you do need leadership. You do need people. You do need the people with the money to actually say we want innovation. I mean, just before we finish, it's been a fascinating conversation with you too. I'm trying to work out how best we can utilize your knowledge and with the skills of drug science and the knowledge to try to move things forward. And will you certainly reach out to us if you would like us to help you in any way, and or if you'd like to help us, because there's a great need, and we could, together. We obviously, a lot more than we do about some aspects, and we know quite a lot more than you do about other aspects. So it would be great if we could work together. I mean, is there a group that sort of represents scientists like you, prison scientists?
I think it would have to be, and I don't think there is as yet. This is as current. The beginning of this is there's no attention to this subject at all by research or by even by activists. There's attention to what happens when you leave prison, but there's, what happens in that black hole of the prison is very understudied. What it would need, I think, would be an alliance of user voice, prison officers, trade professional unions, psychiatrists, and drug science, to come together. I mean, it'd be quite interesting if you organised a forum of those representatives of those groups.
We'll do that. And actually, there's an interesting opportunity coming up, because an ex-prisons minister called Crispin Blunt is now stepping down from Parliament, and he was horrified. He really struggled to believe that the prisons were, when he began to understand what prisons were like. I think he found it really, even pre-Victorian. So he might actually be quite a useful individual to.
Yes, and maybe Rory Stewart might be an alternative. He's
Rory
saying he wants to somehow contribute. So he's a possibility too. Perhaps
that's a great idea. Yes.
He launched the 10 prisons project. So that was 10 prisons that had very high rates of violence and drug use. And he looked at, it was a package of sort of policy initiatives within those prisons. And it did bring, the rates of drug use and violence down.
Oh well, yes, and he's a slightly less controversial figure than Crispin, so that's quite that way. Thank you for that. We will talk some more. I'll go back to our trustees and explore that we're trying to do something like set up a working group or at least have a conference to explore this. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful talking to you and learning so much about what I didn't know.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful.
We will carry on.
Thanks very much, David, it's great.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot.